Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone across Southeast Asia. Good afternoon and good evening to everyone around the globe who's tuned in to today's conference. Welcome and hello from Manila. My name is Rocky Guzman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, and I'm honored to be today's moderator for the plastics panel. This panel on plastics and marine pollution is the fourth being tackled and the first one for the last day of the conference. It's a very important and relatable topic, especially today and particularly in this region. So I'm really excited about this session. Just some hard and fast facts about plastics. According to the UNEP, plastics make up about 60 to 80% of total marine debris. And if the current trends continue, by 2050, our oceans would contain more plastic than fish. The Asia Pacific, and specifically ASEAN, is considered as a major hotspot for marine debris and plastic pollution. The spike in plastic pollution comes from a variety of factors, such as rapid economic development coupled with unsustainable consumption and production patterns, but it also has to do with weak management systems, lack of enforcement, and a general need to strengthen the rule of environmental law. This panel this morning will look at where we at in curbing the plastic pollution problem in Southeast Asia in terms of legal and policy frameworks. We'll also seek to see the initiatives to solve the issue at its core, making sure that no plastic goes to our oceans. We look forward to hearing these stories and solutions that we would like to see scaled all across the region. But first, we'd like to acknowledge and express gratitude to our esteemed panelists for today's session. We have experts from the Center of International Law at the National University of Singapore, the United Nations Environment Program, the Indonesian Center for Environmental Law, and Save Philippine Seas. For the format, the first two panelists will be focusing more on the macro level in the region. We will then have a Q&A portion immediately after. After the Q&A, we will proceed with the last two panelists from the Philippines and Indonesia. They will be discussing more national and local strategies and solutions. We will then have another Q&A portion for all the four panelists at the end of the session. You may ask questions throughout the duration of the presentations through the question box below in your screens. We'll try our best to answer your questions during the Q&A portion, but if we're pressed for time, we'll endeavor to reach out to you during the break. Please be informed that we are also live at our Facebook page and the Ariel page. So without further ado, we're raring to hear from the four excellent panelists this morning. And let's start with the first one. We have Ms. Youna Lyons. Youna is a marine policy analyst trained in both international law and oceanography. She specializes in regional marine environmental protection in Southeast Asia. In the last 3 years, she has focused on marine plastic pollution, bringing in perspectives from both natural and social sciences to tackle the issue. Youna is currently a senior research fellow at the Center of International Law at the National University of Singapore. Youna, welcome, and you have the floor, please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Rocky, for this kind introduction. So I'm going to share my screen, and you tell me whether it works.
Yes, we can see your screen, Youna.
Okay, wonderful. So after this, so what we've been asked, what the first two of us this morning are going to try to do, as Rocky said, is really a broad overview We can't do justice to the plastic issues in the region in 10 minutes. And in fact, we really want to keep to time because we'd like to hear what the comments from the other panelists and the participants. So I will remain at fairly high level, and I hope that it will work. But I'm of course happy to answer any more specific questions. So that will be the structure very briefly. But before I start with the regional context, which has already been partly introduced, I would like to do by way of an introduction, put in perspective. So we are here looking at law and policy, and it's the Ariel is a legal center. And I'd like to put the legal and policy discussion in the broader plastic policy discussion. So you see here a tree of life, which is a cycle. And so we here ask although I do have two hats, but I will use the legal hat as a start. As lawyers, and as lawyers, we concerned with institutional structures, regulatory environment, we do research, and then we communicate to government to support and help government do policy decision making on those aspects. But governments need more, obviously, than law. They need all the subject matter, and that's where it becomes tricky. And particularly when you think about plastic, you need a lot of scientific understanding of where the plastic comes from and what type of polymers and what are the pathways and how it degrades, what is the impact on the ecosystems, where are the hotspots, etc. So a whole lot of very complex questions that need answering. But then you also, as a government, they need to, of course, worry about the business and economics consideration and then the behavior and the perception of the civil society. So it is a more complex picture when governments look at policy than when lawyers look at policy, obviously. So the other big part of science, which is the two that actually in my presentation I primarily focus on, because they're the two that I am qualified to speak about, not so much about the others, is the scientific research on pollutions from marine plastics. And I must confess also that I primarily consider those questions from the moment that the plastic arrives in the ocean. As a trained marine scientist, a lot less familiar with the processes that are on land, which are the critical ones that, in order to turn the tap and stop traffic entering the oceans, need to be also dealt with. So all of this to put the discussion in perspective. Of course, you have economic research, you have social research, and all of that needs to work as a whole. So again, here we'll be looking, we are zooming in, although we will remain at high level of this zooming on the legal aspects and the legal and institutional framework, touching on the way science is necessary in order to inform that framework, bearing in mind that obviously these are only parts of the puzzle that needs to be dealt with by government. So now moving to the regional context, we as a region, and as Boki mentioned in his introduction, we certainly have the world that's looking at us in Southeast Asia. And you can see why, because we are considered to be the countries with the most quantity of mismanaged waste and a large population. And in the context of very high production of plastic, a lot of that ends up in the ocean. So we are the dark countries on the right-hand side of the map. And this is why the whole world is, as his eyes focus on us when it comes to plastic pollution. Now, this is another graph that you might have seen. There are many around, and I'm not going to go through all of them. But this is the one on river inputs. And there are a number of rivers in Southeast Asia. And they are carrying plastic from land-based pollution that is arriving into the ocean. The number of those rivers and the precipitation, so the rain that we have in the region, make these rivers particularly effective in transporting plastic from land into the sea. So this is also one of the aspects of our of the plastic problem, if we want to call it that way, in the region. So if we look at the issue profile, I will go back into why it is such a big issue. So I think you have all seen, I'm sure, the paper is full of it now, and a number of graphs that show the production of plastic. There's all kinds of very gloomy predictions in terms of quantity of plastic in the oceans with a business as usual scenario. When you look at plastic and you try to understand the plastic issue, you can think about the plastic cycle first, because one needs to think where it comes from. And in fact, you realize the complexity of it. And if action has to be taken, in fact, action has to be taken at every steps of this cycle. So you'll have the pre-production cycle, the production, the different sectors that use it. You think about agriculture, coastal agriculture, that's actually quite a large sources also, as well as fisheries, aquaculture, and etc. So we have plastic at every of those. I mean, this is the plastic cycle, and we have plastic in most uses that happen on land, as well as on a lot of the uses at sea. Now, when we look at plastic pollution, it comes in lots of different shapes and forms and sizes. And that's where, again, when you start to understand how much pollution there is, it becomes quite complex, because it comes in very large size, in smaller sizes of a few millimeters, but also in nano sizes. And in fact, it consumes bioorganisms, marine organisms, that then reject smaller particles, and then you end up having nanoplastics. So it is everywhere in our food chain. It's also everywhere in all ecosystems. It's on rivers, on beaches, in seabed, water column, etc. Now, the risks that this creates are important risks, and they touch ecosystems, but also they are economic risks. Some are starting to be quantified, but we're not very far yet on those assessment. There's social risks, there's human health risks, and etc. And when you look at where it becomes trickier, it's the compounded risks, because if we had only plastic, that would be one thing, but we have all of the other stresses on the oceans that make things more complex and create a greater risks, because they add up. So one of the difficulties, and that's why when introducing at the beginning, I emphasized looking at the entire policy cycles and the various aspects of the plastic issue, is that the various fields of knowledge that are necessary, and here I focus only on science and law and policy, the various fields of knowledge ask themselves different questions. And those questions do not necessarily correspond to each other. So the scientist would worry more about the type of plastic, what type of polymers. They will sample seabed and etc. But then getting them to have assessments and work in different parts of a country or different parts of a region that are comparable is not easy. And then second, they would have to inform the legal and institutional questions, because these are the questions that we need to answer in order to be able to apply the international regulatory framework. And so the legal questions that one would ask are, which activity is responsible for the leakage at sea? But the thing is that when you look at plastic particles in the sea in small pieces, it's very hard to go back to the source. And then we also asked what are the international, regional, and national rules that are applicable. which country is that in, which part of the maritime zones, is it land-based, is it sea-based, etc., etc. And the decision makers is going to ask themselves again slightly different questions from that of the scientists or the lawyers. So all of this to emphasize the importance on this kind of transsectoral issues for those various fields of knowledge to be working together. And that leads me to the introduction to our the global framework. So before we look at what's happening at regional level, and here I hope you're not, this is going to be two very heavy slides because I'm about to introduce what we call our horandogram, and it bears its name really well, on the structure of the international and legal and institutional framework for marine plastic. So at international level, we have a number of bodies starting and a key treaty, which is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, that are looking at plastic issues. So you have within the UN system, you have the United Nations Environmental Assembly with a particular mandate. UNEP is the agency that's dealing with it. So without going to also at general level, there is the International Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO that's looking at plastic issues. So all of those bodies, and I can't go through everything that they're doing, but each of those bodies are looking at the issue sort of in general. And then we have particular bodies that have a more specific mandate, and they're looking at waste and chemicals. And so these are the Basel Convention and Stockholm. Then we have the shipping bodies and instruments that are looking at pollution from ships, the plastic pollution from ships. That would include fisheries vessels because they're still ships, however, not fisheries activity because fisheries is handled by yet another body. And the marine life conservation instruments, all of those bodies are also worrying about the impact of plastic on the conservation of the species or ecosystems that they are focusing on. Each of those bodies are necessary. They all have a different mandate. But when we say it is fragmented, it's true in that way, yet they are all actually trying to achieve the same purpose. Now, where it becomes maybe a little bit overwhelming, but that's why it takes all of us to work it out, is when you bring together the entire framework, and I've just lit up in the second half of the slides, the regional framework. And at regional level, so Southeast Asia, we do have a number of bodies, and I will start with COBSEA, as Tamelander will be the next speaker introducing the work of COBSEA, and we also have the ASEAN that's doing a lot of work on pollution from marine plastics. But we also have the ASEAN plus 3, so ASEAN plus China, Japan, and Korea. And then we also have the East Asian Summit that has made declaration on marine plastics and is concerned about plastic pollution in the region. And we also have APEC. Again, these bodies each have a different mandate. They all still working in the same direction. So finding mechanisms and ensuring that we are all pulling in the same direction and we are developing a consistent system, and we are not repeating work that's being done elsewhere is critical. So that leads me to my two last slides. The first one is the one which is about the issues that we are facing. So we know that marine pollution is a big issue for the region. And we know that it's an issue at national, regional, and global level. But there is a low science and policy divide. We also know that this divide exists. There's an important fear of duplication of efforts between the various bodies that I have indicated. And so this sometimes can be a hindrance. This fear of duplicating makes that some gaps between systems can remain. And then it's a very complex framework, as I'm sure you agree. And there is a lot that we still do not understand on the source, the occurrence, the accumulation, and the impact of marine plastics. And this uncertainty, scientific uncertainty, although we are meant to follow a precautionary approach, is not making things easy for policymakers, because then you really have choices to make in terms of prioritization of action. And now looking very closely at the region, the resettlement network at the level of the region, for the moment, is still fairly fragmented. And often when you look at the sources of funding and when you look at the way efforts is being carried out, a lot of the network in the region is looking actually outside the region more than it is looking at inside the region for solutions and resources. And so that leads me to a very optimistic set of possibilities and opportunities in front of us. So I've been working on marine plastic for quite some years now, and on the protection of the marine environment in the region, on other aspects also before. And it's very clear that the amount of research has increased extraordinarily in the last 3 years, on plastic in particular. And we also see that governments are very aware and that they are calling for more research in their own network. They're calling on their universities, they're building the national capacity. And so there is a regional scientific capacity which is developing. And there are lots of sources of funding. So we can shift the situations, and we can, through working together and building all of those efforts, looking at it from a regional perspective and bringing our various national and regional research networks together within fields and across fields that are necessary for marine plastics. So I will stop there, and I hope that this will have two good questions, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussions.
Thanks, Youna, very much for the global and regional context of the plastics problem. You mentioned that there's a lot of science and policy divide, and we hope that we could provide a platform to talk more about this in this session later. So yep, let's go to our next panelist. Our next panelist is Tamelander. He's the coordinator of the Secretariat of the Coordinating Body on the Seas of East Asia, or COBSEA. COBSEA is a regional intergovernmental body for the protection and sustainable development of the coastal and marine environment. Yerker oversees the implementation of the East Asian Seas Action Plan, as well as the Regional Action Plan on Marine Litter. He has spent more than 20 years in international environmental cooperation, from the UNEP to the IUCN. Yerker, thanks for joining, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Rocky, and very, very happy to be here. I have to say, I scrolled through the participants list just before at the start of the session. I'm happy to know that I don't know most of you, and that means we have a good opportunity to exchange information and experience beyond our normal networks, and that's exactly what we need to do in order to address this challenge. I'm very happy to see that. I have to say, I'm also very happy to speak after Youna, because she has so eloquently set the stage for this session, and I think I'll try not to duplicate, add a little bit of flavor to some of the aspects that she touched on, and I hope you can see my slides by now, and let's move ahead. I want to touch a little bit more on the global and regional frameworks in this presentation, talk about COBSEA's role and mandate here, and a few sort of simple takeaway messages at the end that I hope we can delve into a bit further in discussion at the end of the session. But first, maybe a quick sort of question on why global and regional governance is actually needed. And I think to some it might be quite obvious, and it might still be worth restating. And the crucial point here is that marine litter is fundamentally a transboundary challenge. And it's transboundary from a couple of different perspectives. First of all, is that sources and sinks of marine litter may be in different countries. What I throw in the water carelessly in Thailand can end up in Cambodia, etc. So it transports across borders in that way. But global trade, our economy, our production systems, all of that is hugely interconnected as well. So the issue of plastic and marine litter cuts across so many different jurisdictions that it also is a very important aspect in this. Of course, all means that in order to take coherent action, we have to have common approaches and common frameworks, common aims and targets, common standards, and so on at different levels. So it's an absolute necessity, and individual countries can act a lot. Ultimately, it's individual countries that will do the most to address the issue of marine litter, of plastic pollution, but that will be much more cost effective if it's done through a coherent approach. So I think that those of us who spent lots of time on shorelines will know that marine litter isn't exactly new, but it's an issue that's obviously become much more prominent lately, and especially in the last decade and a half or so. At the first session of the UN Environment Assembly, I required all the UN member states to conduct an assessment of the effectiveness of relevant international, regional, sub-regional government and strategies and approaches that are relevant to marine litter. And I think Youna will have touched on elements of this. This request was made out of a recognition that there are many instruments that are relevant in this respect, but there are no instruments that are designed to specifically address this issue. And so it's quite a hefty report. It's a few years old by now, so I will summarize it in one simple slide. But this basically identifies in a different work format many of those agreements that Youna also mentioned. The overarching sort of framework provided by the Convention on the Law of the Sea, the regulations and the agreements under IMO, including the London Convention and so on, the biodiversity-related agreements, the chemicals and waste-related agreements, as well as, of course, many regional instruments. And a few key findings coming out of this analysis is that in binding international law, there is actually a fair bit of relevant provisions that apply to marine litter and plastic pollution, but most of them are quite narrow or limited in scope. So they don't cover the entirety of this problem with binding law. There's slightly more specific and as well as broader soft law instruments, non-binding agreements, but of course, there's a very limited regulatory power, and there's also, in some instances, a lesser sense of achievement or progress tracking on how those objectives are being met. At the regional level, it's quite a similar situation. You have a few legally binding regional instruments, including regional seas conventions and protocols, and I think even one of the regional seas adopted marine litter action plans is binding. Most of the regional seas marine litter action plans are non-binding. They're important, but again, they are sort of a product of their time. One very important finding here is that there is no uniform or comprehensive upstream mandate. So again, as Youna said, many of the aspects of marine litter, plastic in the sea, relate to how plastic production, consumption, and disposal is addressed on land. And there is it's a mixed bag at best. And what this analysis found at the time, at least, is that there is no, for example, there is no element of liability for marine damage from plastic in legislation related to plastics. And of course, that means that the ultimate implications of our use and misuse of plastic are not really catered for in the legislative and policy framework at the global and regional level. It is to some extent in some countries, and this is changing more slowly. So while we have sum total is many different instruments that are developed from many different perspectives to address very valid issues. We need them all. They are crucial, but they are, as they apply to marine litter and plastic pollution, they are they're very much a mixed bag, and they intertwine in a sort of slightly uncomfortable way. And going back to Youna's first slide and the tree of life, you can say this is actually a Gordian knot of regulation, of instruments, and we have to somehow disentangle that, but also not disregard all the utilities provide. So with that, I will focus a little bit on work through the UN Environment Assembly. So this analysis that I just tried to capture in a single slide was requested by the UN Environment Assembly at its second session. The UN Environment Assembly has also adopted a number of other resolutions on chemicals and waste, sustainable consumption and production, single-use plastics, and so on. I'll focus this discussion very much on the marine litter side, and especially the ad hoc open-ended expert group on marine litter and microplastics that was established by UNEA to explore barriers, response options, their costs, the feasibility, effectiveness, and so on. And in its first meeting, one of the most important statements by this AHEG was that status quo is not an option. So when we're looking at options, status quo, we have to understand it, but keeping it as things are is just not an option for sustainability. And it also gave this strong recognition of upstream activities and the necessity to have a more coherent approach there. Now, through its sessions, AHEG 4 have elaborated further on this, and at its fourth meeting late last year, it actually concluded its work for presentation to the fifth session of the UN Environment Assembly. And this identifies specific response options. It also includes results of stock taking, an inventory of available technical and financial resources, an effectiveness assessment of existing instruments and measures, etc., etc. So there's a big volume of work that's actually available and that is being put before UN member states. But I'll focus again on these response options here because they're a little bit interesting, perhaps particularly in the context of this conference. So first of all is that AHEG response options, it's not an exhaustive set, nor are these options mutually exclusive, but it's a bit of a menu that the expert group is putting to the Environment Assembly to debate so that a formal decision can be made on the right pathway forward. And it's a range of issues here that may be pursued. I think when you look at them, you'll see very much that they can be mutually reinforcing. Crucial here is that there has to be some form of common vision towards elimination and elimination of discharge. And clearly we have a strong foundation for that. There's a common vision in many instruments. There's a high degree of alignment there. It's not perfect yet. There's a need for national action plans and their implementation, and for that to cover all life cycle stages of plastics. And I think it's the last bit here that requires the most work. There's many action plans. There's much effort here. It is not comprehensive enough. It recognizes this need for regional and international cooperation. I'll touch a little bit more on regional in a moment. The scientific basis, as Youna said, needs to be strengthened, and a few particular priorities there, multi-stakeholder engagement, etc. It recognizes the opportunity to strengthen existing instruments, including the Basel Convention, including non-binding efforts and instruments, G20, for example, etc. A particularly interesting element here, or one that has caught a lot of attention, is this discussion around a new global instrument that could be legally binding or be non-binding. It could include specific elements, including reduction targets, design standards, the phasing out of avoidable plastic products, facilitation of national and regional plans, scientific knowledge, and coordination of financial and technical resources. And emphasis here is on quite a strong voice for a global agreement among many groups. So some countries and regional groupings have expressed quite strong support for this, including going as far as outlining elements of what could be included in a new instrument, a new binding instrument. But of course, there are also countries and entities that are perhaps more lukewarm towards a new agreement and see a need for assessing whether a new agreement actually enables us to get to the depths of this challenge, or whether it risks defaulting to the lowest common denominator and then becoming too narrow to really have a fundamental change. So there are different elements that need to be considered, but this is undoubtedly going to be a significant part of discussions at UNEA 5. Watch this space, but I think UNEA 5 will have quite a significant impact on how this discussion goes forward at the global level, and conversely then, of course, at the regional level. So a quick look, and I will try to speed up a little bit, but at the regional level, I wanted to focus here on the regional peace conventions and action plans. I mentioned them before. They cover most of the world. Many are administered by UNEP, but not all of them. They've got a basis in UNCLOS and provide this means for regionalization of global frameworks, for identifying and addressing region-specific priorities in regionally appropriate manners. And of course, by virtue of having been there for a long time, they have strong networks, established processes, a good deal of trust. The UNEA resolutions that I mentioned before, they all also emphasize the need to work through the regional peace, as does the G20 action plan, the G7 priority measures, and so on. So there's also a global recognition of the need to leverage those instruments. If you look at it on a map, you can see them here, not geographically accurate boundaries. That's just sort of a graphic design rather than accuracy. But this shows you that most of the regional seas have adopted action plans on marine litter. It also shows you which ones have binding conventions and which ones operate on a non-legally binding modality. That includes, of course, COBSEA, that I will speak about in a moment. COBSEA is the regional peace program for the East Asian seas for protection and sustainable development of the marine and coastal areas of the East Asian Seas region. Now, the 9 COBSEA countries actually adopted a regional action plan on marine litter in 2008 on the back of global and regional assessments conducted or catalyzed through UNEP. So this was a sort of emerging issue that was taken up by a very large range of regional seas already at that time, and gradually over the next decade pushed the sort of the issue up the agenda towards UNEA resolutions and the attention it currently has. Now, COBSEA's regional action plan was revised in 2019 to make sure that it really aligns with the new global frameworks and priorities, as well as the 2030 agenda. And it includes actions on land-based sources, on sea-based sources, on monitoring, as well as enabling conditions that speak about awareness, networks. It speaks about policy frameworks and coordination, capacity very much. So our action plan, while not a binding instrument, it actually provides for a sort of comprehensive source to sea or upstream downstream approach. Another important feature of the action plan here is that it establishes the COBSEA Working Group on Marine Litter, which is a standing formal working body on this very issue, again with the remit to address all the aspects of the COBSEA regional action plan. So it's a body that can be leveraged in taking further action. Now, looking at what COBSEA is and how it's shaped vis-a-vis the other elements of the region, this is also from a different way of illustrating what Youna already spoke about, and I'm happy to also say that we have a very good collaboration with Youna and Center of International Law on this. It's to look at how these different frameworks interlink. In this region, we obviously have ASEAN as a very important mechanism, with the Bangkok Declaration the other year, with a framework of action that was agreed, and an action plan on marine debris being developed. COBSEA and ASEAN have a very high but not complete overlap in terms of geographic remit. COBSEA and ASEAN +3 have a very, very good alignment, but slightly different still. There's also the APEC grouping, obviously, includes many of our countries as well. So it's a little bit of a mix and match situation. And what it all means is that we have a high degree of complementarity in terms of priorities, in relation to international policy frameworks, in terms of waste management as it's addressed in these different instruments I just mentioned, scientific networking, awareness, knowledge management, and so on. The language aligned very well. Geographically, there's a good degree of alignment. The COBSEA Regional Action Plan is perhaps relatively more elaborate on monitoring, on national action plans on marine litter, on the issue of removal. And this is, of course, very important when we look at beaches and seas where we can turn off the tap on land, but all the plastic we sent there in the first place still remains there. So removal shouldn't be entirely disregarded, even if it's very challenging and not always cost effective. And of course, the RAPMALI has this science to policy body in the working group. The ASEAN framework, and let's see how the action plan looks when it's actually finalized. But the ASEAN framework places slightly more emphasis on the multi-sectoral mainstreaming, the private sector collaboration and private investment. And this, speaking now maybe from a personal perspective, it's a very positive signal, because the ASEAN is, let's remember, it's all those branches and boxes that were on Youna's horrendogram. It's not an environmental instrument in itself. ASEAN is a political and economic regional movement, a process, a body, and so it cuts across all aspects of society, just like plastic does. And so through ASEAN, there's an opportunity to start dealing with the marine litter challenge from all the different perspectives that it needs to be dealt with, not only as a marine and marine environmental issue, but also as a production issue, as a plastic standards issue, as a labeling issue, as a waste management and recycling issue, and so on. So we have a great opportunity there, I would say. And I also want to emphasize that there is an ASEAN UN work plan, which includes elements of marine litter and plastic pollution, which should be seen as a good collaboration and enabling framework for really making the most of these synergies that exist. So that brings me really to the end of what I wanted to say. In simple terms, I think we have a clear need for a lot more legislative and regulatory policy effort at the national level, across the plastic value chain, across sectors. And so this requires coherence, and that coherence is quite difficult to achieve because of the very sectorial nature of how we are organized. So we've inherited a lot of history that it's good because it gives us structures to work within, but we have to start also breaking those structures to improve coordination, and challenges are really significant still. As Youna said, there's a lot of needs for more science and data, and I don't think there's how should I say? It's not for want of knowledge that we don't take action. I think action is currently held back by the difficulty in the societal sort of transformations needed, but there's plenty to act on in terms of how big a problem this is, how much we need to take action, and so on. With that in mind, regional cooperation still, maybe more than before, has a very crucial role in that it can catalyze action in line with regional or with international frameworks, as I already said. But when the global situation moves, the regional lens provides maybe a more operationalizable level for science collaboration, for knowledge transfer, for capacity building, and so on. We obviously have a decent track record on that across the different regional entities. But at the same time, geographic scope of different regional mechanisms differs. The governance modalities differ. It reflects often the national sectoral context, and so those same challenges apply. So in sum total, this means that we have to build on and leverage these existing mechanisms and processes. They're the best ones we have, but we have to make them sort of sit together better than before, and mutual leveraging is probably necessary so that we can get to the depths with what's a very wicked problem indeed. And the other point I think Youna also made here is that now there's so much attention to this topic, which is great. That's the basis for solving it. But there's the multitude of effort risks duplication or redundancy, or it risks even contradiction at times. And so while we should encourage effort at all levels, we also should assume this responsibility of not disregarding the big body of work that exists, and rather making sure that efforts are additive and additive to what's already in place, rather than duplicating it, because then we will sort of walk in circles instead of really walking forward. So in summary, that's what I had. I have a couple of charts that may be useful to show during a discussion session, but I will leave it at that for now, and hopefully we'll have time to speak a bit with the audience as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jirker. Yes, I think we've had a good fill of elaborate webs of like the policy instruments globally and regionally. And thanks for highlighting the need for more coherence, and highlighting actually the need for like solving the problem in all stages of the plastic life cycle. We have a lot of questions for our first Q&A portion. Let's go forward with some of the questions. A lot of them about the legal framework. So let's start with the first one from Pei Xuan Chang, sorry. She asks, like, how do we properly view Southeast Asian countries in the scenario of global marine plastic governance? Are they major polluters or the major victims? And as a follow-up to that, will the common but differentiated responsibility principle work for the global marine plastic pollution legal framework, and how? Oh, so I think Youna, if you can, sorry, if you can elaborate more on that.
Yes, the plastic issue is not framed at the moment so much in terms of responsibility and liability, and it's probably fortunate. because it's really a mixed bag, and it's so the drivers are so complex. So I mean, I've started whilst listening to Jirker on a topic that we're both very familiar with. I started answering some of the questions that were in the chat, thinking we're not going to have much time, so I should give it a go. I don't think that the positioning of victim or responsible party is very useful in terms of liability, responsibility and liability at the moment. But what you're looking at in the context of trade, for sure, trade of plastic waste, is that what the Basel Convention is doing, and the amendments that are coming, and that have been some are applicable since the 1st of January, are meant to prevent, so are acknowledging basically this different responsibility by different level of developments and states. So developed states must not send their dirty plastic to developing states, and so that's one of the it's one of the debates. And I think that now that it's a very well-known debate, it's a lot harder. I mean, the UK are a bit in the eye of that discussion at the moment, because their new regulation is not as stringent as the EU regulation was. But I think it would, if there is much dirty plastic, as in non-recyclable plastic, which is sent to countries in the region, they're likely to refuse it. And so they should. because the waste management in the region is an issue. And the infrastructure, we are lacking, we have weak infrastructures generally, and so they can't cope with it. Yeah, I don't know if that answers. It's a frustrating answer on the on the legal question, which I understand, but I'm happy to take that offline with Peshran if you want. On the
Jurgen, would you?
If I may, just to add, and I think that's a good answer from you, and it's clear that this region, most countries, all countries are significant contributors of marine litter. We don't need to debate that. But this is not a discussion about pointing fingers and blame. I think you can look at any country in the world and you can take them to task for different elements of how they go about their business, including the example of trading your dirty waste out of your shores and getting it off your books. And so, yes, the Basel Convention amendments have dealt with that issue to some extent. I do think on a more general level, this is it's a symptom of how plastic as a material has been developed and become a central part of our society without looking at how the different elements of the plastic life cycle actually affect society. So plastic is very cheap. It's also a fantastic material, and that's why we use it every time. But it's also cheap because the production and the benefits of selling it accrue in one place, but the downstream management of it doesn't necessarily get funded in the price of the plastic itself. And so this is not to say you put the full weight of all aspects of plastic management with a plastic producer, but it is an acknowledgement that a public sector that has struggled to finance waste management in this region for decades struggles partly because it's not resourced effectively, and it's not resourced effectively because there's not a business model to be had. And so somehow there's many companies now that are at the forefront of turning waste into business, reducing waste, but also converting what is commonly determined to be waste into a monetizable resource, and that's a good way forward. But there's also things that prevent this from happening more effectively. So, for example, there are the multitude of different plastics, the use of different additives in plastics, and how this influences their recyclability is quite challenging. And so again, here you could say there's a lot of protection of the intellectual property of businesses in relation to the plastics they make or use. But if that is not public enough, standardized enough, and so on, it also makes the lower side of the value chain, the recycling and waste disposal, more difficult. And so there needs to be a lot more discussion on how these different bits of the chain can be tackled so that the leakage can stop, and so that we can have a situation that actually is not a business problem, but a business opportunity. If you allow me to share, actually, one slide, which is a terrible illustration, but I would like to share that with you. Just 1 second. This one, if you can see it, this is a simple illustration of all the plastic ever made, as in since plastic started being made in the 50s. And so if the primary production is the big chunk there, you can see that the plastic currently in use is also a big segment here. But of all the plastic ever made, half of it has just been discarded, more than half, simply discarded. And if you look at the loop at the bottom, that is recycling. So primary recycling is quite a thick line, but in the greater scheme of things, it's not so thick. But plastic is recycled once, but the secondary recycling of that same plastic is again a very, very fine line. So at the moment, or in our 50, 60-year history, recycling has done very little to get us out of the problem of discarding plastic. And so obviously the solution lies in all the blocks on this chart. We need to change every aspect of this chart in order to have a lasting impact. It's not enough to say let's just recycle. We absolutely must recycle, but that in itself is not enough. We must change how we use plastic, but we still need to use plastic, and we should not discard it the way we currently do.
Yeah. Yep. Just a quick follow through also, Yerker. I think you started with it already, like the amendments to the Basel Convention and its entry into force. So someone's asking like from Aji Satyawan, like why is it that the issue of mismanagement or waste management has yet to become a national priority in ASEAN against this backdrop of all these amendments and conventions entering into force?
I would like to hear Youna's reflection on that, but I will maybe say one thing before that, and that is, I think it is a priority, and I think it's a recognized priority, and I think the challenge has been really following through with the broad-ranging efforts that are needed, and the challenge here is that it is a bit of a wicked problem. There are so many social and economic and environmental dimensions interlocking that it is tough to do. So I think we're in the good position of having recognized the need and the priority. We're not in a good enough position with having addressed it. And I'm happy to speak a bit more about why, but maybe I'll pass it to Youna first.
Youna?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I think I agree with what Yerker said, and my perception is also that it is indeed a priority in the region, very clearly. But the Basel Convention only addresses the trade of plastic waste. So the discussion at the moment is what plastic can be traded between the countries. So what plastic waste can be traded between the countries. So what the ban is doing is that it is forcing the exporters of plastic waste to be more careful about the composition of their what they're trading, and then if it's not clean plastic of a certain types of categories, because it's a very detailed set of rules, then the countries that accept it has to provide its agreement and has to make sure that they are able to deal with that plastic. So when this comes in, but it's coming into force now. So, let's see how this is coming into force. I'm aware of a lot of governments, because we are working with them and helping the capacity building within the governments in the ASEAN, that are actually working on it and developing their regulatory frameworks. They're envisaging the various scenarios that are going to happen and how they're going to respond to it. Now, you also have to think about one thing, which is a difficult one, which is the corruption elements that can come into that. It's actually a big black market, the trade of waste. So we can look at it in a very simplistic way, or we can say, in fact, the reality, the ground is trickier, because whether it's coming from the exporter or the importer, you might have people who actually do not respect the rules of their own country, but you need to find those networks because they're fairly organized. Mm-hmm. So, but I think waste management is a priority. Mm-hmm. But it's easier said than done.
Yep. The illegal waste trade deserves another topic, another session completely. One more question. I think there have been a couple of questions wanting to know more about the litigation aspects of plastics. So if you could tell us if there has been any litigation on plastics that relates to the right to the environment, and if there are they against like corporate giants? Do you know any?
So this is not something I follow very closely, I must say, because my ears is closer to the science and the technical aspects of it and the litigation. The thing to remember for people who consider litigation is that litigation is national. And so when you think about a giant, whether it's Coca-Cola, Nestle, or Procter & Gamble's, they all use large quantities of plastic. You're going to go, it will be in a country against a particular subsidiary of that giant. And then you can only sue that company if they're in breach of the national legislation. And that's where... Is the connection bad? No. So that's where you can't sue a huge. It's more complicated than that. It's more through discussions and damaging and impact on the brand that there will be. So we've lost. We've lost our host,
Rocky, but
right?
we have Paolo here, so
but we have
let's go on.
Yeah, so I think it's primarily it's something to remember, is that it has to be looked in a domestic context. But I suspect that actually among the other panelists and hosts, that they know more than I do on that very specific litigation question. So I will let them do it. Yes.
I wanted to add one small element, but also deflect this question perhaps to our host. But one thing that I wanted to speak about is not the litigation process per se, but the alternatives to that have sprung up. And so, for example, if you think about schemes that extend the responsibility of producers and they sort of through effectively a collaborative mechanism assume a greater responsibility, but also financial model for assuming that responsibility. It's a means by which some countries have tried to pursue a situation where you sort of perhaps reduce the need for litigation approaches because that is so difficult. And I don't know, it's a partial solution, but it is one avenue that might also sometimes be easier. But of course, litigation is probably going to be needed in many cases, and it probably is good to start testing it and establishing prejudicates with great difficulty.
So thank you, Jerker and Youna. I like the idea as a litigation lawyer.
I knew you would.
but again, I think as Youna mentioned, that ability to apply international law in domestic context. I mean, we know that from Basel Convention and other conventions, there is still the need to transpose those international laws. And if they're not transposed strongly, then domestic enforcement can be quite challenging. But I think, and I'm sorry that Rocky has suffered the energy challenges that often occur, but can I thank you very, very much for your presentations, and we will move on to our next two discussions. I'm not sure if you were invited to stay, if you're able to stay to the end for further discussions. You're very, very welcome, of course, but I also realize that you may have many other obligations. Plastics is a very much a full-time occupation, but thank you very much indeed for the presentations and for answering the questions. Thank you, Yoka. Thank you, Youna.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
So can I now move on to our next speaker, and I think our next speaker is Bella Nathania. Hi, thank you very much. So Bella is a researcher, Pollution Control Division for the Indonesian Center for Environmental Law, one of the great supporters that Ariel has had. Yesterday we heard from Dodo, Executive Director. So thank you again very much for being here. And I think you're able to share your screen, and I'll let you take away your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. Hi, everyone. Today I'm gonna try to explain more about the initiatives to combat plastic waste in Indonesia. My presentation will be divided into three main topics. First of all, I will try to address the current conditions and also the current regulations that we have in Indonesia. And also after that, I will try to explain how to reform the current conditions and also the regulations. And finally, I'll try to explain more how the regional collaborations will influence and drive plastic advocacy, especially in Indonesia. First of all, I would like to give you some illustrations on waste compositions in Indonesia. As you could see that organic waste is dominated the waste compositions in Indonesia. After that came the plastic waste. These situations happened because in Indonesia, we don't have mandatory composting. That's why the organic waste is totally dominating the whole waste compositions. Aside from the waste compositions, we also got problem because we still have an end-of-pipe approach on waste management. For example, we very much relied on waste collector who tried to collect the waste and then transporting it to the landfill. That's why in our country, many landfills will be over capacity by 2021. One of them is the biggest landfill in Jakarta called Bantar Gebang, which actually will over capacity by March 2021. So it is like 2 months from now. I would like also to illustrate what happened actually in the landfill in Indonesia. For example, this landfill is actually near my house. So as you could see, the landfill is right beside a riverbed. There is a wall that separates the river and the landfill, but most of the time the wall will be collapsing. That's why the waste will be overflow into the river. That's why, as Youna said before, the river will be transporting the waste from this landfill into the marine area. That's why what we do in the land area will be influenced in the marine area mostly. Also, I would like to explain to you about the law that governing plastic in Indonesia. We got several of it. First of all, there is law number 18, year 2008 on waste management. We also got government regulations on domestic waste management. We also got regulations on marine debris management, and also the EPR regulations. And finally, we got about 35 local government regulations on SUP's ban. The existing regulations, in my perspective, is not enough because we try to have a very centralized approach on waste management. So the central government and the local government still hold a very, very big influence on waste management. If I try to compare it to what happened in Philippines, the Philippines tried to decentralize its waste management to barangay, which is very, very good. And it could become a model on waste management in Indonesia, actually. And also, we are very lack of monitoring and law enforcement. And finally, our budget is very small on waste management. The budget, of course, a sufficient budget is very important because a sufficient budget will propel a good implementations on waste management. I will try to explain more on lack of monitoring and lack of law enforcement in Indonesia. First of all, we have lack of public officials. There's very limited size of public officials in Indonesia. For example, our local environmental agencies only consist of maybe 30 up to 40 people or public officials, while they should try to monitor about 2 million households, for example, in Jakarta. So there is 2 million households that you should monitor. And of course, it's not included the industries, which is also got a very large number of it. That's why there is disproportions between the size of the public officials and the job that they should done. And also we are lack of law enforcement in Indonesia because we are not mandating waste separations. I think mandating waste separations is very, very fundamental for a good waste management system. And also we are not have a stringent law enforcement on the producers to establish a plan on waste reductions. I want to explain more about the lack of budget, as you could see in here. The World Bank is actually try to establish a number that there should be 20% minimum budget for waste management in developing countries. But what happened in Indonesia is all of the waste management budget is actually under 20%, like you can see in here. The municipality of Bandung is only on 1%. The city of Bandung is one of the highest in Indonesia and only consists of 2%. Jakarta is only 1.4%, and 80% from 1.4% is used to establish an incinerator. And city of Cimahi is on 1% of the total budget. So you could see how lack of budget is actually go hand in hand with how we manage our waste management in Indonesia. So what we actually could do with these situations as a lawyers and as CSOs. Myself actually already done many things to propel or reform change on waste management, but we are not working alone. We are working with the other 8 NGOs on plastic, that we form an alliance that called Alliance for Zero Waste Indonesia. And we got a different specializations, if you could say. It's like ISEL is very specialized in the legal aspects, and we got another 8 NGOs that specialize in campaigning and also the technical aspects of plastic. First of all, ISEL tried to develop regulations on waste management that try to use the zero waste approach. So we tried to put forward administrative sanctions instead of criminal sanctions, because administrative sanctions is more effective in Indonesia, because you don't have to put much of the time during the litigation process like the criminal sanctions. And also we try to put forward the use of incentive or disincentive. And also we try to decentralize the waste management system by adopting what happened in Philippines, and we try to decentralize the waste management to village. It is more or less is the same with the barangay in Philippines. And also we are mandating every house owners to conduct waste separations, which on the national level is not mandated yet. And also finally, we are mandating local government to develop a solid plan on waste management, because a good plan will propel a good implementations on waste management. And also we try to offer inputs on regulations, especially on the EPR regulations, because the policy that tried to establish in the EPR regulation is not stringent enough for the producers. So they are not mandating the producers to have a plan on waste reduction that is stringent enough, because the producers can choose between how they want to reduce their waste. For example, they could choose between the reuse, reduce, and recycle. Of course, if I become the producer, I will choose the easiest one. For example, the recycle one instead of the reduce. And also, the regulation is not having a stringent policy on recycling, so the producers could choose a more sufficient for them, a more sufficient recycling method, for example, with chemical recycling. And also we try to expand the public participations to criticize the producers' plans on waste reductions. Talking about litigations, ISELs try to have litigations on plastic. So we try to petition a judicial review on presidential regulations that try to accelerate the development of waste to energy plant with incinerator technology. And the lawsuit is actually successful. So the Supreme Court revoked the regulations on 2017. But the presidents tried to establish a new law that have more or less the same substance with the one that revoked, because he sees that the overcapacity landfill issues is very dire situations. That's why the easiest part to burn all of the waste. So he thinks that the easiest part to solve the problem is to burn the waste. That's why he establish a new regulations on the waste to energy plant with incinerator technology. Even it is not economically viable anymore. During the COVID pandemic, our advocacy is very, I don't know how to mention it, but it is very influential. The COVID pandemic is very influential for our advocacy because the local government that we try to assist is not adapting enough with how we manage to do online meetings, for example. It is as simple as that, the problem. And also there is a delay in the implementation of the EPR regulation, as I already explained before. Actually, the EPR regulation should be implemented this year. So the producers should submit their plan on waste reductions, but actually it is not happening because of the COVID pandemic. And also during these situations, we also got a new perspective on how to control plastic waste consumptions from food delivery and online shopping. Finally, I will try to address how to regional collaborations will drive plastic advocacy, especially in Indonesia. So I think Indonesia could learn from success model in other countries. For example, how to regulate and effective sanctions and economic instruments. And also how to regulate microbeads, because there is no regulations on microbeads in Indonesia. You could not see it even in the EPR regulations. And also how to connect between the climate litigations with the plastic issues. And finally, I think regional collaborations is very important because in plastic issues, we face very big enemy, for example, the petrochemical company, and then the multinational corporations, the FMCGs. That's why regional collaborations will be propel the change in plastic issues. I think that's all from me. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Bella. I do apologize for being disconnected. Thank you for discussing from where we left off. I think on litigation, you touched up on that, and of course the context in Indonesia and the recommendations for ways forward. Now let's proceed with our next panelist. She is Anna Oposa. Anna is a change maker best known for being the executive director and chief mermaid of the Save Philippine Seas. It's a movement to mobilize citizens for collective action and behavior change. Anna has been at the forefront of numerous projects and campaigns for environmental education, waste management, and she also serves as consultant for various organizations such as the UNDP, the UNEP, and the Asian Development Bank. Everyone, let's have it for the chief mermaid, Anna Oposa.
Hi, Rocky.
Hi.
Thanks for that very generous introduction. And so again, I'm Anna Oposa. I'm the executive director and chief mermaid of Save Philippine Seas. Unlike a lot of the people watching and unlike a lot of people speaking, I am not a lawyer, but I did grow up with a lot of lawyers. So it has become my hobby to write policies and advocate for policies. So during my presentation, I'll be talking about citizen action. So we like to call our followers as citizens to remind them that we are all connected to the ocean. So Save Philippine Seas is an organization that I co-founded when I was 23, and we are turning 10 years this year, so you can easily compute my age. And we have three different main pillars. First is engagement. So we do a lot of partnerships and engagement with different stakeholders from governments, businesses, other NGOs, schools, and individuals. We do a lot of education campaigns. So pre-pandemic, we actually traveled all over the country, especially to coastal communities, educating them on why we need to protect the seas. So when I was looking at the chat earlier, I saw some people saying that education is really important, and I absolutely agree. And I'll share with you some of the education campaigns that we at Save Philippine Seas have started and are still continuing, and how we're doing it during the pandemic. But most of all, SPS is very much passionate about empowerment. So, how do we get citizens to take action on the different issues? How do we turn education into action? So for the next maybe 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to go through some of the lessons that we've had in the last 10 years. So first is to use your imagination. You know, SPS has always been a very small and very poor NGO, but you know, it's the lack of resources that have really made us resourceful. So a lot of the Filipinos, you know this, that the Philippines has been called the social media capital of the world. We spend more time online than any other nationality in the world. So this is something that SPS has capitalized on. Early on, when I was starting out, I was really confused about which government agencies to contact for certain violations. Because in addition to plastic, SPS also works on illegal wildlife trade and shark conservation. So we came up with a series of infographics called Know Your Government. And the basic objective was just to tell people what these government agencies are doing. So these are available online. So my background is actually in communications. I was an English major at the University of the Philippines, and I really thought all my life that I would grow up to become like an artist or a writer. So this is the way that my storytelling background has infiltrated the advocacy. So this is the Know Your Government infographic series. This was released maybe 6 years ago, so I think it needs some updating. And then, if you are familiar with the movie Mean Girls, we took some inspiration from that and created a series of infographics called Meet the Plastics. And this is just a series of infographics on the common plastics that you see in everyday life and what are the probable alternatives that you can use. We also came out with a campaign. We did this for a couple of years, and it's called Eco Guilt. And what we wanted to show people was that the zero waste lifestyle is not easy, and we want to normalize, you know, the challenges when it comes to aiming for a zero waste life, because I think, you know, social media also contributes to this, that everyone thinks it's easy, everyone thinks it's glamorous, but then, you know, it's hard to find alternatives, or sometimes it's expensive or requires a lot of commitment. Let's say like menstrual cups requires a lot of commitment. And because Filipinos are known to be romantic, am I right? Filipinos, we created an infographic series called Waste Free Weddings, and we launched this a few years ago, and it's still one of the most famous social media campaigns that we did. So this one gives a guide on how we can reduce waste during weddings. One of the things I also learned, you know, I started in the environmental advocacy when I was very young. And when I had the chance to start my own environmental program, I wanted young people to feel empowered and supported, and not just as passive learners who just sit there and, you know, listen and take notes. But I really wanted young people to have and to be equipped with skills to carry out their own advocacy. So in 2015, we came out with this. I founded this program called the C Camp. And since then, well, except for last year, obviously, we have held 11 camps all over the Philippines. And we also had a couple of camps targeting Southeast Asian youth. And what we do for a whole week is, you know, the students, our C campers, they do outdoor activities, they learn about the state of the marine ecosystems, but they also learn transferable skills such as campaigning, public speaking, writing letters to leaders, project management, budget management. These are skills that nobody taught me when I was starting out, you know, and trying to build an NGO. These are lessons that I wish people have taught me. But what makes the C Camp unique is at the end of the week, they actually have to go out in the real world, meaning outside the venue, and talk to different business leaders, hotel and restaurant managers on how they reduce plastic waste. So that everything they learn is not just in their heads, but they're actually going out in the wild, and applying these skills. And what I love about this exercise is that they learn what it's like to be rejected. They learn what it's like to be supported, because, you know, as an advocate, these are things that we all go through. And it's important to know that we don't just succeed during our first or second or even third or fourth try, and that along our advocacy, we will always get rejected, but there will always be supporters as well. So through the C Camp, I learned that when people say youth are leaders of tomorrow, it's not quite accurate. I think we also have to acknowledge that youth can be leaders of today, but that has a little asterisk, and to say that youth can be leaders of today if they are given the right opportunities and they are given the right skills. And we can do that by, again, turning education into action. So our C campers have created different campaigns to reduce waste, different approaches, different techniques, different materials. And we've packaged this in a project called Waste Watchers, which is obviously a play on Weight Watchers. And you'll see a lot of puns in the SPS materials. This is how my English major background has found its way. But we came up with this campaign called Straw Wars in the Philippines. This is back in 2015, and this has been replicated in Brunei and Malaysia. We also came up with Plastic Battle, which is on reducing PET bottles, especially in areas where there aren't a lot of recycling facilities, or, you know, the Philippines and Indonesia as well. We're made up of a lot of isolated islands where it's very hard to get infrastructure or waste taken out of the island. So we wanted to reduce it at source. So we work with resorts, hotels to provide refills, water refills, instead of putting PET bottles in the hotel rooms. We also came up with Defying Gravity, which is about reducing lanterns and balloons in events. And all of the materials that we've created, so those are just three of the many toolkits that we've created. They're all available on the SPS website, which is sayphilippineseas.org. And everything is free, everything is open source. You could even put your organization's logo if you want. So this is what it looks like in terms of the toolkits. And when you open a toolkit, all you have to do is sign in using your email address, just so we can track how many people have downloaded it. But this is an example of a toolkit. And when we were creating this, my question to our very small team was, think about the time when you were 18, 15, wondering what you needed to start an advocacy. So everything is here, from a deck, a letter, something that you put on the table when you're ordering something, stickers, signs on the door. And we want to make it easy and accessible for people so that there are less or fewer barriers for them to start their own campaigns. Another thing that I'm very, very, very passionate about is to not preach to the choir, but to build the choir. I'm not interested in reaching the same people and talking to the same people all the time, focusing on just environmentalists. Of course, it's important to get support within our field, but then how will we succeed if we don't bring more people in? So one of the things that we started a campaign 2 years ago called Mainstream Refilling. And what we wanted to do, this is a petition to create safe, sustainable, and accessible refilling stations. And this is particularly for personal care products like your shampoos and your body washes, and also home care products like your dishwashing liquid and your laundry detergent. So in the Philippines, and I think across Southeast Asia, it is prohibited to refill personal care products because of safety and hygiene reasons, which is completely understandable. Of course, we want to prioritize safety and hygiene, especially now. But then with the growing volume of waste, both Indonesia and the Philippines have what we call a sachet economy, where a lot of our household essentials are sold in sachets. And the argument has always been, because of the socioeconomic situation, they can't afford to buy things in bulk. And I completely understand that. We completely understand that. But what if we can use that type of approach and convert it to refilling stations so that you only buy what you need? So this was filed in 2019 in March. So we're almost hitting our 2-year mark. It did not go that well. I will just use those words, but we're still at it. We're still pushing for it, and we're still working closely with industry partners and the Food and Drug Administration and the Department of Health in the Philippines to make sure that this is not forgotten, even with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I actually just checked the petition a few days ago, and there are almost 10,000 signatories. And we created this public-facing petition to show that it's not just the environmentalists who are pushing for this, but consumers want this as well. And I was surprised to see that in the last week, there were actually maybe like 6 new names, and that's us not even pushing this. So that's good to see that people are still looking for ways to support this. With the pandemic, it's affected our work, obviously, like everyone else, and we've created infographic series using the best available science. We've put, we read so many journals and references to create this series. It took us a while because we wanted to get the facts right and the references right, but it's called Plastics in the Pandemic, Facts versus Fears. And we lay out the fears of people with science, the best available science that we can find. And we also came up with a reuser's manual. So just some tips that we're advocating for to reduce your plastic waste. I'm sure this has been covered in previous talks that plastic has surged in the last year because of the pandemic. And so going back, I just added this actually right before I spoke because of the messages that I saw on the chat. And Save Philippine Seas is coming up with Earth Education kits. We used to have this program called, well, we still have it, but it just changed in shape. We have this program called Earth Education where we would train teachers, public school teachers specifically, on environmental education. So we used to hold workshops, experiential workshops, and obviously we can't do that anymore. So now we're adapting and we're creating these Earth Education learning kits in partnership with different corporations. This is just a mock-up of what we're trying to do. And the first one is going to be distributed this year. We've been working on it for several months, covering different topics, including waste management. But the plan in the long run is to create very specific topics. So we're creating one on climate change because one of our funders is very focused on climate change. But our 2 other plans for this year is to create learning kits for circular economy and waste management and species conservation. In the last year, we've received so many messages from teachers, from parents, from guardians asking us if we can create kits for their kids because, a lot of people are at home and looking for things to do. So we decided to brainstorm on this, and we're already we're almost at the prototype phase, and we're planning to start deploying these in March. So with that, that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to spend more time discussing and maybe answering questions. But hopefully my presentation in the last, maybe, I don't know how long I've been speaking, but I hope that it sparked something in the participants and my co-panelists and the organizers, and maybe together we can make waves. So thank you. And I look forward to discussing.
Thank you, Anna. It's always a pleasure to have you. I've been to one of her sea camps, and I think it's really life-changing if I were the participant there. Yep. So thank you, Anna, for extending environmental education to reduce waste for all and making this topic very fun and approachable to all of us. Thanks, Bella and Anna, for these national and local and community-based solutions to reduce plastic waste. I'll now open to some of the questions. But first, let me call on also Yerker and Youna, if they could also join us in the Q&A portion. The first question is, where did it go? It went out. Okay, so let me focus on this question. Like, how has innovation and development in technology, like for instance, extracting energy and flue made from processed plastic, how has it helped in this campaign against plastic pollution? Like, yeah. So if you have any thoughts on these like developments in technology, like extracting of energy or flue made from processed plastics.
Maybe just two quick words from me. I think rather than that specific example, I think it's worth saying that alternatives, new technology, and new processes and so on are going to be a critical part of the solution. There's no doubt about that. Replacing plastic with other materials when it's meaningful is clearly an option. And using different approaches to making and using plastic is definitely important. So in general, this has to be part of the solution. I'm not comfortable to speak about that specific example because I don't simply have the knowledge. So I will put that aside. But I do want to also emphasize that when introducing alternatives, for example, then it really needs to be done with a sort of a life cycle approach in mind. And I think this is where our approach to plastic hasn't always been so good, is that we've made plastic permeate our entire lives without a life cycle approach. Yeah. Now, when we're looking at alternatives, let's not repeat that mistake. Let's make sure that we really know what we are replacing or how we are fixing the problem. And it takes a lot of effort, but at the same time, it probably makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Just let me tag to that question. I found the question that I was looking for. So the question was like, what are the options, considering all the impacts of these options to the environment? Is there any environmentally neutral solution for this, like not just on the control of production, but specifically on the disposal of plastic waste?
So I can jump in. Actually, also the previous questions, I'd like to add two things to provide legal backing to the point that Youna made. We must not transform a pollution into another sort of source of pollution when we're combating the first pollution. That's very clear. It's written black and white in the law of the sea. And so it's certain that in treating our plastic, we don't want to create another just as important problem. The other thing, and that's also relevant to the subsequent question, is that different places require different solutions. So the use of plastic, for instance, on small islands, whether it's in the Philippines, in Indonesia, or in the Pacific or Indian Oceans, obviously the treatment of it is not the same than what can be done in places where you have large recycling facilities. So from the moment you accept that plastic is necessary for some applications, then there needs to be different solutions in different places. Quite agree also with the life cycle approach.
Youna, maybe Bella?
I would like to add more context to it, to add what Yerker and Youna already explained before. So for example, in Jakarta, because of our waste proportions, we try to suggest biological treatment as a swift solutions to the waste management issues. But actually, I think in a very long term, zero waste is still the best way to approach the waste management, because, for example, in Japan, they use the end of pipe approach to it, and it is not economically viable in the long term. That's why I think, and compared to Philippines, some of the cities is already already regulated zero waste, and I think it is more economically viable in Philippines, and it would reduce the waste management budget very, very small. I think that's all, Rocky.
All right, thank you. We have a couple of questions. I'll lump them together related to COVID and plastics. So first is like, what are your perspectives on this like barrage of plastics related to COVID, these face masks being flowing to the oceans and the rivers? How do you prevent this and mitigate the scenario? And another follow-up to that question is, if we don't have incinerators, how do you deal with this toxic and hazardous waste. Like in specific, many places in Southeast Asia do not have these incinerators. So who would like to take a first stab?
Okay, well,
Youna?
you can look at it at two steps. The first step is not having them thrown on the road, on the ground, on the beach, and etc. And there's a place for social behavior, possibly regulator. When you get to the regulator, it's always a tricky one. But they possibly need to be some sanctions if for behavior to change. Each community has its own set of functioning mechanisms. So then the second issue is the management of that waste. And we fall back. I mean, it's a glaring this plastic, all of this disposable plastic that has come out of COVID crisis, not just in the mask, but also in the fact that people get the things delivered, and so in delivery packages, you end up with all the foams and stuff that come back. So we have the impression that all the progress that had been done before, you've just gone backward. You could bring your container to the shop to get whatever you wanted for a while before COVID, and now it's no longer hygienic enough, so you can no longer do it. So, but yeah, so there's two. It's actually putting the plastic into a really harsh perspective of when we really need it, obviously, and we can't get out of it. So it puts the finger onto, okay, so what is the plastic that we can recycle? What are the polymers that we can do something with? So if we look at it from an integrated life cycle and circular economy context, what can we do to avoid having just that waste and more waste and dilution of resources in the meantime? Because any new things that's being made is made with products. So we're depleting something else in order to do that, and then it's going to be thrown away. So yeah, it's not. Obviously, it doesn't work.
I mean, if I can add, if anything, I think COVID sort of exposed existing weaknesses or vulnerabilities in our system, as Youna implies also. And, we've had an increasing consumption of certain types of plastic. At the same time, there's been a reduction in the demand for recycled plastic, which has led to a reduction in the price of recycled plastic, which has driven a lot of recyclers into bad business. And I think some studies done by other organizations have shown that at least half of the recyclers in the region are permanently or temporarily closed because the business is bad, partly because of this cost issue. And then on top of that, waste management and recycling here relies so much on the informal sector and the informal waste pickers, and their working environment is of course challenged by this situation, and their risk exposure is very high because of COVID. So that has further complicated the situation. And so what this means is that we may have the justifiable argument for increased use of certain types of plastic products, although some of it has clearly been excessive. But secondly, had we had better systems, this wouldn't have been a challenge, but it is. And I go back to the original point, is this is exposing an underlying weakness, because COVID brought this to the fore, but the same situation happened before as well. Like, recycled plastic should be cheaper, it should be more incentivized than virgin plastic, so that it encourages broader use. And that's not necessarily the case. It's still too easy to use virgin plastic when you maybe want to drive it towards other forms of materials. So lots of underlying stuff. And then in terms of the other aspect of the question you said in terms of incineration, I think also this goes back to this point of what is good waste management, what's a good waste hierarchy. And clearly there's a role for incineration in some settings, but it needs to be pursued with the right sort of assessments and the right technology. And incineration with energy recovery and with the right sort of controls on additional sort of toxic emissions has its place. It's part of the solution. Chemical recycling may have its part in the solution, but it requires, again, those very strict controls. And whether there's really a readiness to do this across the board, I think it requires very, very careful attention. But then it is also part of the set of solutions. But burning it is not always the ultimate solution, and burning without energy recovery is probably indefensible.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jürger. Anna, your thoughts? I know you have a lot of campaigns during this pandemic on behavioral change. Maybe you could shed light on that.
We have been trying to work with corporations on finding solutions, especially in the pandemic. It's been a challenge, especially because of the fear of contamination, which of course, they're very valid concerns. I was looking at the chat, and there's a lot of discussion on alternatives. In the Philippines, a lot of cities have switched to paper bags, and a lot of companies are switching to bio-based plastics as well, which has its own set of problems. But I think ultimately we really have to try to reduce at source first, and then for me, it's good that we have these innovations for different alternatives, but we have to conduct life cycle analyses to make sure that alternatives are not going to do more harm than good. And right now, I think we're still in the very early stages of seeing what the long-term impacts of these alternatives are.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And just one more question, for all of the speakers, I guess a lot of people have been asking, we've identified some of the weaknesses in the legal framework, but what would you suggest are the domestic laws and the interventions that we need to introduce to really combat this plastic pollution problem across the region, and also since we're pitted against some large corporations also, how we can deal with that? So who would like to suggest?
Maybe
I can. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Anna.
Go, Bella, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, maybe I will start. I think the best way to have very good regulations on waste management is to establish a very good organizations, and then to establish a very good funding, as I explained before. Funding is very essential, and also how to establish a very good operations. Start from the very small part of the waste management system, like the barangay or the village in Indonesia, up to the landfill, for example, and also how to establish wide and expanded public participations, and finally how to establish a very, very good regulations that have a very good law enforcement and also have a very good law monitoring systems. Mm-hmm. I think that's all, Rocky. Thank you.
Thanks, Bella. Others? Youna?
Yes. Okay. I think that there's no solution for every country, and it's very hard to set a hard rule like that. But what is certain is that waste has to be valued. So I don't know if it's through and the pickup of waste has to be valued by those who dispose of it. So the informal sector has done would have been a model for the West, I reckon, in this part of the world. And yet, I mean, since so I've been in Singapore 11 years, and the last 11 years I've seen the informal sectors just go down. And now getting you Karanguni to come and pick up and get your newspaper, which I think is the best way to ever. I don't want him to give me money. I just want the newspaper to go back into the system, right? But just that is no longer actually as easy as it used to be, because in cities it's a lot harder. So, but then you look at different countries, and I think really different situations, not even countries, different communities. So it's really a difficult one to answer as a hard rule. But maybe in some places, putting a dollar value on refuse has certainly played a role, because if your recycling is free and indeed you have pollution, you have a funding that's from the government on that particular aspects, but you have to pay for the rest of the waste, you'll see very interestingly how suddenly there's a lot less waste. But then what can happen also is that if there are public bins still available, then suddenly they will overflow unless there is a system of surveillance. And I mean, no one wants to live in a world like that. So you really, these are difficult trade-offs in order to change people's behavior and the way they relate to waste, and they realize that everything that they do generate waste.
If I can add to that, I think that's spot on, and maybe generalizing a bit, but a big challenge here is often that, you know, we have certain requirements in terms of waste management or other regulations at the national level, but the actual responsibility, the mandate for waste management is pushed down to municipal level. But then the revenue model for funding good waste management is not at the disposal of the municipal level. So you don't have the capability, or you can argue that sometimes it's the right level of organization for some aspects, but it's not the right level for some others. And then if a municipality is not empowered to generate revenue on the basis of waste collection, then how are they going to do proper waste collection if the sort of central level allocations for that aren't sufficient? And how are they going to do that? Yeah, if as Youna said, you know, me as a consumer should probably be tasked with reducing my waste by making me pay for how much I throw out the door. And that's going to make me a much more conscious waster. And I think it's part of the problem. But then we also need to enable municipalities, and probably through private sector collaboration, to actually make this work. And as things stand, we appointed it as a business opportunity, but in practice, it's going to have to be effectively subsidized in different ways, or incentivized more effectively to make it a proper business opportunity. It isn't really there yet.
Yeah.
With exception, with a lot of exception, but it's not there.
Anna?
So everyone has said such good things, but for me, as someone who has lived and grown up in the Philippines, it's really about making the law work. I mean, Republic Act 9003, which is the Ecological Solid Waste Management Act, was passed in 2000. That's a long time ago. And the data says that, so for example, one of the provisions is to require every single local government to have a materials recovery facility. And now it's 2021. And so far, only 34% have complied. And then when it comes to sanitary landfills, only 24% have complied. So it's really about making the law work. And then leading to that is my second suggestion, which is to pass the refilling policy to allow alternative delivery systems. And then, that's one way that we're going to significantly reduce the volume of wastes being thrown. And there's an organization in the Philippines called Philippine Reef and Rainforest Conservation Foundation, and they started micro refilling for soy sauce, oil, things that we see at home. And within months, they have reduced 74,000 sachets just in a few months. So imagine that was just 8 stores in one province in the Philippines. Imagine if all of the islands in the Philippines could do that. And then third and last is to work with the corporations and the governments. I always joke that Say Philippine Seas is like Switzerland, or like neutral territory, because we work with everyone, and I've been questioned a lot about, why are you working with these multinational corporations? You're the top polluters in the world, blah, blah, blah. But for me, it's like, it's good that there are organizations calling them out. That's great. But there also has to be organizations calling them in, or else we're just going to be pointing fingers at each other. And by opening that dialogue, I have more empathy and a better understanding of the challenges in waste, because it's just so easy to point out what people are doing wrong, but then understanding it gives you a different perspective. And for me, as an advocate, and a policy hobbyist. I don't know what to call myself. I'm not a lawyer, but I've, worked with a lot of lawyers. It also gives challenges and opportunities on how we can maybe craft laws that are more enforceable and also work with consumers in making them work.
Great points. I think we touched up on some of this also, but there's a lot of questions actually on the role of manufacturers of plastics. Like, I think Bella mentioned also the extended producer responsibility, EPR. So how could we make this operational across all the countries in ASEAN, since this is a real problem that has been identified?
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll jump in for the start. First, I saw in the chat one of the questions, why can't we stop plastic? And has the production of new polymers of plastic, new virgin plastic, been stopped? No, we can't. And actually, the simple reasons why we can't, because it's like stopping technological advancement and research. And there's an immediate cost into it's actually extremely hard to start touching R&D, research and development generally, because it's progress. So now the question is, how can you constrain to make sure that new polymers that get invented are considered within the cradle to grave life cycle kind of approach? But then maybe not all polymers are designed to be used in very large quantities. So it becomes a question of applications. And there's also someone who makes the comments about hospitals and the disposal of plastic in hospitals. There you have a conflict between the environmental concerns and the health concerns, and generally health wins. It's all about survival. So they're hard conflicts to deal with. But when you look at that, contaminated material from hospitals, certainly the recycling is a real issue. You can't do what you want with it, and you cannot deal with them in the same way than you would with normal household items. So, and the organization of the industry, I think it's coming, because there are industry groups. So you have industry groups at the level of refineries, and so the raw plastic producers, so the polymers producers. Of course, you have labs that do research new types of polymers, but they're not outside the loop of this discussion. There's pressure on them to justify the output and etc. So it's the development of those discussions. That's what Anna was saying before, and I couldn't agree more that the engaging with people we disagree with is a step one. To understand why it is a problem for them and why. So there's something, obviously, if we disagree, is that there's something that we don't see in the way they think, in the same way that there's something they don't see in the way we think. And so getting to understand those complexities is the necessary step. So it's just, the trouble is that we press with time, and that the system is so complex, and it involves so many different stakeholders. And so you have the raw plastic producers, and then you have the different, so you start with your beads of polymers, and then they get smelted, and then the products gets conceived, and you have so many different steps and such a chain of intervening parties that they all belong to different circles that overlap. And then you have the big buyer, your Procter and Gamble's, and that I should stop talking about them and mention another one. Kraft. Unilever. But I mean, you also have your own smaller, but also plastic buyers in Southeast Asia, whose name is maybe less well known, but they also produce, and they're under less pressure because their brand is not under the same pressure than the Western brands maybe. So, and it's, bringing all of those people around the same table. That's what it's interesting to look at other parts of the world. That's what the US actually has been even during the previous administration. It's an effort that has already been ongoing. In Europe, it has already been ongoing. It takes time, and structuring it in the region will help the discussion.
Thanks, Youna. Anybody else? Yerker?
Just a very quick point, and that is, on the specific sort of tool of EPR, extended producer responsibility, I think you're starting to have a lot of examples from different parts of the world where this has been applied. And of course, it's been applied to things that are non-plastic for a longer time. Like, I think you could argue that production of batteries and so on in Europe, it's quite a good example of an EPR kind of scheme. And I think with plastic, there are more and more. And that while there are many challenges, I don't see why you could not demonstrate for a specific set of products or plastic polymers or something, EPR within this region, and basically build confidence and comfort that this can be done without being too disruptive, and on the contrary, being a possible solution. But it's not something you can simply throw at a problem and expect it to work out. And I think there's much that has to be put in place for that to happen. And I'm going to stop this there. I'm also going to say that if I suddenly disappear, it's because my battery is now flat. So I take the opportunity to say thank you to the organizers and to co-panelists. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, Yerker. Maybe Bella and Anna for this question. And
I want to add more context to it. First of all, the EPR regulations in Indonesia is not touching the petrochemicals industry and also the plastic producers. So they are only regulating the retailer, the FMCG industry. That's why I think there is a gap on how to regulate the petrochemical industry. I think the idea to regulate the petrochemical industry is to limit their movement by establishing a stringent standard on emission standards, I think. And if we speak about the petrochemical industry, I think we can connect it with the climate justice, how to try to have a common ground on climate justice, because the emissions of the petrochemical industry is actually very damaging for the environment. I think with the climate justice and climate litigation, all of the region in ASEAN could speak in a more similar sense on how to approach these issues.
Yes, thanks, Bella. There have been questions on how to link it with climate justice as well. So it's good that there are people like looking at it from this angle. And Anna, maybe?
So in the Philippines, there's been a proposal for a policy on extended producer responsibility, but it's very vague, as a lot of our bills are, and the devil is in the details, as they say. But what's interesting for me when working with a lot of corporations is also driving behavior change. So for example, there's one multinational company that made a switch from plastic straws, the juice packs. So, plastic straws have been demonized, so they switched to paper straws, and they got a lot of really angry feedback from their customers because plastic. I don't like paper straws because they actually turn soft after a while. So there are all these concerns that we also have to think about, like the convenience for consumers, the price point for consumers. So I think a good EPR policy should consider and account for all of these things. And it's a big task, and I don't think anyone has figured out the perfect answer for it. It's a journey that we all have to be part of. Yes, exactly. That's the
Chucky.
I wasn't gonna say the brand, but but there we have it. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Anna. And sadly, I think that's all the time we have for this panel this morning. I know there are a lot of questions. We can extend it later on. I mean, if the panelists will be staying on for lunch, then it would be nice to engage more with the audience. But yes, thank you for the panelists. I know that ASEAN faces a lot of problems, but with the right policy frameworks and community-based initiatives and national and local strategies, I'm optimistic that we can solve this plastic pollution problem. So to the panelists, Youna, Yerker, Bella, Anna, thank you very much. And if you could stay on, we would really appreciate that. All right. Now, just for a few announcements for the conference itself, we will be having a poll for some interaction on what topics would you like to have more for our event. So we will be launching a poll now, and we'll be taking maybe 1 to 2 minutes for you to answer this. And we'll be announcing the results of the poll later during the closing ceremony. So we hope to see you there. So you could, there. The poll is now launched. So we can have like a few minutes to answer this poll, and we'll be announcing the results later. And some announcement as well. We'll be leaving this webinar open for the rest of the next 2 hours for our lunchtime for the next hour. But at 1 p.m. Philippine time, we'll be starting with the Ariel Environmental Lawyer Award for Asia and ASEAN, where we'll be honoring some of the outstanding lawyers of the region and Asia. So we hope to see you there. And at 2 p.m. Philippine time, we'll be proceeding with our last panel for the conference, which is on oceans and fisheries. We'll be proceeding with the blue agenda for today. So that will be from 2 to 4 p.m. Philippine time. And at around 3:30, towards the end of the panel, we will be doing our closing ceremony. So we hope we can see you there also. And please, if you would like to stay on for lunch for more interaction, we would love to interact with you as from the organizers and the panelists. And we hope to see you in our events this afternoon. So again, this has been Rocky Guzman. Thank you very much, and have a good lunch all. Oh, just a follow up. The link will be the same. This will be the same webinar where we'll be having the Environmental Law Awards and the next panels.